Hello.
World.
Hey, folks, check out this interview that we did with Brian Kernighan, the guy who actually was the first person to ever write Hello World. We did an hour interview with him, and it was pretty awesome.
It was super awesome. He gave us a lot of insight about his career, his time working at Bell Labs, contributions to Unix, to C, other things you've probably heard of, and also some great advice for all of our students out there all around the globe. He has been around the industry and academia forever, so you'll definitely want to hear what he has to say.
So check out the interview, the full interview, and thanks for watching. We are here with Brian Kernighan, professor of computer science at Princeton University. Brian worked at Bell Labs during the 70s, actually all the way up until 2000, but during the creation of Unix and the C programming language. He is the creator of the AMPL and awk programming languages and has written many Unix programs. He's written several books as well. He co-authored the eponymous The C programming language, and more recently, the Go programming language and Unix, a history. Welcome, Brian Kernighan.
Hey, thank you, Bert, Morgan. It's a pleasure to be with you folks this morning. It's morning here. I'm not sure what time it is wherever you might be. Just the wonders of remote conversations.
I would say it's bright and early here, but we're not even quite to daylight yet, so soon enough. So, in addition to that intro that Burke just gave, for people that didn't know, you are also quite famous for being the first person to write Hello World as an example. And all this time later, we're still doing it. It's known to be the rite of passage, essentially, for all programmers and developers for decades, which is pretty phenomenal. So I guess my first question for you is, if you were to go back and do it all over again, would you still choose Hello World, or would you pick something different, and why?
Wait, it's a fun question, Morgan. And I guess in hindsight, I'd do the same thing because it's been remarkably successful. It was never intended to be anything more than just a throwaway. And I get asked from time to time, where did this come from? And my memory, which is now probably completely meaningless because it's been so long, is that somewhere in my life I had seen a cartoon that showed a chick just coming out of an egg, and cracking, little head poking out, and a caption that said "Hello World." And for some reason, it stuck with me, and so somewhere I wrote a program that did that. And the rest is history. I have no idea why it's been picked up. I don't know whether it will last forever. Is it the right thing to do? Hard to say, but there are web pages with Hello Worlds in hundreds of languages, if not more. So maybe it's useful in some sense.
Well, if it makes you feel better, on the useful sense, I have that as my personal website domain instead of Hello World. It's hellomorgan.dev. So you've inspired more than just the first line of programming, that's for sure.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we are actually starting a new show on our Microsoft Learn TV called Hello World. So it just continues to show up in all the places.
Well, gee, you guys could give me royalties, right? Sure.
We really should. You need a shirt that says it.
So how did you get into computing? I think a lot of folks that are looking at computing today, there's this sort of idea that people who are programmers always knew that they wanted to do that, and they grew up and they were always looking at computers and always messing around with things. But when you were growing up, computers weren't as much a part of mainstream culture as they are today. So what was your introduction into the field, and how did you know that that's what you wanted to do?
Yeah, it's probably fairly hard for people in whatever audience we draw here to realize just how long ago it was when I first started doing this, because I saw my first computer, I think, when I was a junior in college. So this would be back in the early 1960s. So I really didn't have anything. There wasn't this, grow up wanting to be involved with computing in some way, because in a sense, there really weren't very many computers. I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto in Canada, and there was one computer for the whole campus, basically, one big computer that lived in a big room. And it was by far the most powerful computer in the whole country, and there probably weren't more than another couple like that. And so my experience there, this looked like an interesting thing, if you like, and I got to do a tiny bit of programming during a summer internship, I think at the end of my junior year, if things were right. So somewhere in that period, I learned to be a really bad programmer. I was writing COBOL during a summer job, and I was writing Fortran, little bits and pieces of it during my time at Toronto. And then when I graduated, I went to Princeton actually as a graduate student. And that's where I started to actually do a little bit more computing. They had actually the same kind of computer at Princeton. It was basically the only computer on the campus. And so I did some work with that as well. And somewhere along the way, I decided this stuff is actually fun. I thought I would be an electrical engineer, but it didn't take in the same way. And the computing stuff was some combination of it's interesting to see the computer do things for you, and it's kind of like puzzle solving and playing a game in some weird way. So I enjoyed that part of it, but it was a long time ago, and computers were really very much less accessible. They were expensive to buy and expensive, therefore, to use. And so access to them was much more limited than it was even 20 years later, and certainly totally unrelated to what it is today.
Certainly, and I know that Malcolm Gladwell actually writes about this in his book, the name of which escapes me at the moment, but about Bill Gates and sort of how he was successful. And one of the things he had access to is these time-sharing systems at like a local school and university, and we've come such a long way in that everybody has now the ability to do the things that you really needed special access and privilege to do back then.
Yeah, one wonders how the world might have been different, whether you folks would be working for Microsoft, whatever, if Bill hadn't had that opportunity when he was in high school to get a taste of this stuff and discover that it was a lot of fun. One really wonders. I know the book is Outliers, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, that's correct. That's the one, yes.
Right. Yeah, and there's another person mentioned in that book, Bill Joy, who was, I knew a lot better than I know Bill Gates, who was one of the founders of Sun Microsystems. And again, he had that advantage of having access to computing very, very early while he was still, I can't remember, but probably in his early teens. And so that, I think, the timing is such that probably made it a lot of fun because it was novel. It was something that was different. Whereas today, everybody's got a computer, so the novelty in some ways is not there to the same degree. But I think the fun is still there.
I agree. It's interesting about the novelty because I agree, right? As soon as you see something everywhere, it just is how it is. You get a 8-year-old who expects to get an iPhone for Christmas, just a very different world. But at the same time, I think it takes a little bit deeper understanding to say, I want to create things for that. I want to create an app. I want to build it, I want to get into machine learning. I want to get into cybersecurity. And I think that your point actually about when you're introduced to computer science, from either, a very high level concept to actually writing out your first hello world, still in some cases is the same. Obviously all over the world, and even here in the US, a lot of schools that are, underfunded, don't have access to any sort of STEM program, even if they wanted to, and that really puts them at a disadvantage of having that experience, even potentially getting into university, or just knowing that it's an option. That's one of the reasons that I love what I do at Microsoft, is because I feel like I'm actually getting to get out there, getting to help students, getting to volunteer and mentor. And we have philanthropy programs and everything, as do a lot of others, Girls Who Code and Black Girls Code. What do you think is the industry's really responsibility in helping bring up that next generation of developers, whether it's folks who do have access to these technologies and how we help them, but how we're also reaching out and helping those people that don't? So, 10 years, 20, 30 years from now, we say, the next, Bill Gates came from us helping them at that point.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think corporations and individuals and lots of other institutions of society have that responsibility to make sure that the next group of people is in some sense properly educated, has access to the same kinds of opportunities, or hopefully even more than they did before. I know Microsoft's been very supportive of K through 12 programs, for example. Brad Smith in particular has been active in that. And so I think the more of that happens, the better off we all are, in sort of first just a broad societal sense that we will all be better off. But I think also it's in the interests. You would like to be able to hire really people who know something or who are interested in things, who have a broader view of what possibilities are, so that you can reach out to more of society. And from my side at university, I would like to have students who come in turned on by a wide variety of things, interested in lots of different things, not just technology, not just STEM kinds of things, but whatever. And so I think all of that comes back to education. I'm not sure education is as well served today as it could be in this country. And so seeing more resources put into that, wherever they come from, seems to me like, very enlightened self-interest.
Yeah, I like what you said there about also having individuals well-rounded. I think that's incredibly important, even if you're going to be the world's, best programmer, because it does. It helps you problem solve. It helps you pull from different sources. Even when you were talking about electrical engineering and, kind of step by step and fitting it together as a puzzle. My undergraduate degree is actually in mechanical engineering and management engineering. And so those taught me a lot about things that now I'm able to transfer over to the technology sector. So I totally agree that I like calling them transferable skills, but I think they're incredibly important into growing as, both a person and a professional.
Yeah, I think roughly speaking, almost anything that people do is interesting. And so people should find the thing that they are most interested in and explore that and use that as a way to connect with other things and other people. And it doesn't have to be pure technology, but it's great if it is. There are things that I think are common across all of these areas. One is the ability to write, so that you can write well. That's helpful. It's nice if you can write for people who are not in your particular area. So if you're doing mechanical engineering, it'd be nice if you could explain what you do to somebody who is a history major. And the other thing, of course, is to be able to speak well. And again, to people who are not necessarily exactly like you or in the same kind of background or whatever. So I think those are important transferable kinds of skills, as well as the, say, somewhat more focused things as well.
Absolutely.
You've said in this interview and in others, I've heard you say that programming is fun. And I would completely agree with this statement. But I have 3 kids, and one of the real struggles I've had is convincing them that that is the case. I think for a lot of people that are on the outside looking at it and not familiar with the field, it doesn't look fun. It looks scary and it looks intimidating. There's lots of strange characters, there's semicolons and there's brackets, and there's quotes everywhere. And it's just not something that looks like people want to sit down and, I want to do that all day, every day. What would you say to students and people looking to get in to convince them that programming is fun?
I think it's not going to be fun if you're pushed into it. And so I'm not going to tell you how to raise your kids, but pushing kids in a particular direction is often brings up the equal and opposite reaction problem. So you don't want to do that. But if there are ways in some way entice them more or less accidentally into something that might have a programming or computing component, but it's something else that they're interested in. And that very much depends on the person, what else is going on in their lives. So, for example, people who are into sports, one sort or another sports, are full of statistics. Okay, think of baseball, something like that. It's all interesting numbers about how people did in various situations and so on. What can you do with those numbers? Could you, or one of your kids, let's say, who might be interested in baseball, start exploring what can you do to create your own weird statistics for baseball games or something like that. So whether that would work or not, I have no idea, but that is one possibility. I think games is another one. I think a lot of kids are very interested in games, and games have to come from someplace. There are tools that will make it possible to build games, maybe not super sophisticated, but pretty decent, fairly easily without a lot of expertise. The Unity game engine, I'm told, I haven't done it, is one of those possibilities. And so I think it's partly, maybe even mostly, find something that a child might be interested in, try and dangle the bait in front of them, but in a form that they can get started and get some sort of gratification fairly quickly. Because you're right, it can be very frustrating. Conventional programming languages suffer from a surfeit of syntax, semicolons and parentheses and public static main void, whatever the heck. All these kinds of things make it scary and off-putting in the first go-round, I think. So how do you get around that? I don't know.
Well, I would agree with that. And in fact, in my own experience, one of my 14-year-olds is very interested in the stock market, but he's 14, so he can't trade. But what he can do is use some of these programs that allow you to run basically simulations. And in order to do that, you have to write what's called ThinkScript. So he uses a program called Thinkorswim, and he gets an immediate output in the form of a graph that shows his money going up or going down. And he's very interested in that. And so while he writes a lot of ThinkScript, he will still tell you, I have no interest in being a programmer. That doesn't sound like a fun job. But he is a programmer.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so ThinkScript, that sounds like an interesting one. Sounds like something I should know about. Another one that sometimes draws in, especially kids, is Scratch in its various guises, which is a much more visual kind of thing. So you can drag and drop little boxes that represent various kinds of programming elements. And that can be used even by very young kids. And again, what they're doing is something that's very interactive. The entry cost is quite low in a sense. And they can do things that might be interesting to them. Stock market's a great one because that's another one with lots and lots of numbers. So if there's a latent interest in just numbers or latent interest in money.
Right, that's what it is. It's the money.
You have to have something that drives you, right? I have the reverse example. My younger sister is just finishing up her degree in chemical engineering, and she does not have much interest in sports. However, my husband and I talked her into playing fantasy football with us this year because I described it as it's statistics, but you can win money. And she's like, oh, okay. And then she ended up beating both of us. So I'm going to call it beginner's luck. But I think finding those points of kind of convincing people either way or giving them examples that they're really attuned to is helpful. And I loved your comment about Scratch. Microsoft actually has a program. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's called Make Code. Very similar to Scratch, drag and drop based programming. There are a ton of different modules. You can actually create different games. There's guidance for it. But the really cool thing about it, well, there's a lot of cool things about it, but one of them is they'll give you a virtual hardware setup, so to speak. So let's say you don't have a Raspberry Pi or you don't have an Arduino board. They'll give you a virtual one. So it's a cool way to interact if students and kids don't have access to that. There's various levels. They have integrations with Minecraft and everything too. So once again, that gamification. But when you're in there on the block-based, there's actually a toggle at the very top of the screen, and you can toggle over to, I believe it's JavaScript. And so the thing I love about that is it not only teaches younger children to get used to the interface, but when they're ready to take that next step, they have that logical next step of, hey, when you drag and drop the blocks like this, now it's converted over to, a real programming language or something like that, which I think also touches on that instant gratification that you talked about as well.
That's interesting. One of the problems that I ran into with Scratch, I didn't use Scratch directly, but I used it in Google's App Inventor, which was basically Scratch for generating phone apps. And the problem with all of these seem to be that you ran into a limitation with the graphical stuff, and then where did you go at that point? And so what you just described, where you could say, okay, now let me see the JavaScript code or a JavaScript equivalent of that, then all of a sudden the box opens up again and you can go outside of it. And so that sounds like actually a very useful kind of thing. I shall have to go and look at that.
Yes, please do. They do a phenomenal job. It's entirely free, all of the different modules, like I said, different levels, bringing in hardware. They even have kind of arts and crafts that you can do with it. So if you have a pipe cleaner and this and that, and then we're going to code them and make them work together, and you just use the output from your computer. So it really is just amazing seeing how technology is becoming accessible for younger generations, which I think leads me to my next question actually for you is, do you feel like to be a professional programmer, you need to have a 4-year degree, that's really crucial? Or is it something that can be learned in some different form, either self-taught or a boot camp or something like that? I mean, a couple decades ago, your only option for learning was going to a university, even just to have, the computing power to do so and to have the resources to do so. But now with so much open source and the boot camps and everything else, it really has become more democratized and is widely available to the public. So I would just love to get your viewpoint on that.
Yeah, I think it's not an either or at this point. I think it's a sort of continuum. There are fairly regularly on sites like Hacker News discussions of, do you really need a degree, or can you just pick it up on the street, as it were? And people coming down on both sides of the question. And as I say, I don't think it's one side or the other. I think it depends on a combination of opportunity, what was available to you, and the energy or your investment of your own self that you put into it. So, I'm in a school that has a 4-year program in computer science, and that's fine. And I think people come out of that probably know more about, let's call it more substantial, the underpinnings in some sense, let's call it some of the theoretical aspects of it, what makes an algorithm more efficient or effective than another one. In fact, what does that mean? They may have a richer variety of programming languages that they have had some formal training in. And they've had this forcing function all the way along, which I'm sure you will all remember from school. Of there's a weekly problem set or an assignment or something, and you have to do the work. You can't kid yourself about whether you're doing it or not. Whereas if you're learning it on your own by reading tutorials and so on, the forcing function has to be totally internal. And I think it's hard for people to keep up with that. I mean, there are an astonishing number of good courses in places like Coursera and edX and all kinds of others. But the drop-off rate in those is pretty high. So lots of people start enthused and then they just run out of whatever to carry it through. And so one of the advantages of training, whether it is in a 4-year university setting or a community college setting or a boot camp where somebody is paying money either explicitly or implicitly, all of those things are forcing people. And I think to some extent you need that. What comes out the other end, I think probably as a guess is mostly determined by the individual rather than the details of what they went through. So yeah, I mean, you could see the same question at another level. Should you go straight out of school, an undergraduate school, and into a job at, let's say, Microsoft or something like that? Or should you get a master's degree or a PhD and then go to wherever? And again, the trade-off isn't obvious, and you can be very effective in lots of settings, either with or without more credential.
I wanted to ask a question about Unix, and specifically for those who didn't know, and I didn't know this till yesterday, but Unix is really sort of the first one to have the concept, if I'm not mistaken, of a hierarchical file system and nested directories. And the computing platforms that people have today, especially kids, are phones and mobile devices. And mobile devices completely abstract away the concept of the file system from the user. And the file system is a really core concept And one that I've seen a lot of people struggle with when they learn to start coding is the fact that they have to begin to understand a file system in file types and file extensions and things, some of these core concepts. Do you think that we've done a disservice by making computing so consumer-based now that it's difficult to go from a ubiquitous computing platform like a phone to actually building an application for that phone?
I think in some ways we have. Let me correct one thing. The notion of the hierarchical file system, I think probably originated with Multics, which was the precursor in some sense of Unix, although the version that showed up in Unix was particularly clean and simple, at least by contrast. And so it's sort of what is there in various forms in pick your favorite operating systems at this point. But I think the trend, and especially when we've gone to graphical interfaces, and I would go back to Windows 3.0 or something like that and come forward, a lot of what's going on under the hood has been sort of hidden. And you don't actually know what's there. And therefore, in some sense, you don't have a clean model of what is happening. So, for example, several different kinds of graphical systems have this notion of dragging a file from one place, a folder, whatever Microsoft Explorer is now called, dragging it to someplace else. And the question of, did that make a copy or did it actually move it from someplace to someplace else? And that's all on a desktop. And then a phone is even more mysterious. And to the point where I have no idea what's going on in the phone. I don't use my phone a heck of a lot, but when I do, I genuinely don't know what's going on with where information is stored, nor with the process model of, is something running in the background or not, and what's the relationship between these things. So I think a lot of what goes on there has been hidden. And maybe that's appropriate for the world at large. I mean, the average person probably doesn't need to know a lot more than how do you push a couple of buttons to make a phone call or text or call up a map or whatever it is they want to do. But I think for people who want to do something further with these things or just want to be more effective users, it would be nice to have a clearer model of what's going on and in some ways make it more explicit. At least as a guess. That's kind of my thought.
Yeah, I wonder if we haven't made it actually more difficult to get into programming than it was, say, 40 years ago. What do you think about that? The fact that when I was growing up, it was Windows 95. And so by the time I started coding, I knew what a file system was. I was very familiar with file types and just the essentials of an operating system. But is it harder to get into development now than it was, back when you had to know those concepts to use the system?
I think in a lot of ways it is. I mean, programming a phone is a nightmare in roughly speaking. And I don't care.
What do you mean?
Well, if you try to write code for iOS or Android, and probably for the Microsoft phone, and it was still around, it was just terrible. It's just incredibly complicated to the point where I just say, I'm not going to bother. I've got other things to do with my life. So in that sense, we have hidden it. Some things go even further. If you think of the iPad, which is a perfectly nice programmable device in principle, there's no way you can do anything harder to get in and figure out what's going on and be able to write simple and straightforward programs, at least on the devices themselves. Now, you can often do it through the intermediary of a browser, which is not quite the same thing. So I've been using, for example, Google's Colab, which lets me write Python code basically with them doing the computing, but providing me with an interface so that I can, provide input and I can access my local file system and all the other things that are sort of hard with a standard browser interface. So I think that's a substitute, but it's not quite the same as having your own computer totally under your control where you can do anything you want. As you could, for example, with Windows 95 back in the day, because you could always sneak down to the command line and see what was going on underneath.
Absolutely. Sorry, just one more, Morgan. I just want to follow that up.
Yeah, I knew you would.
Sorry.
Where you're going with it.
The collab is such an interesting thing because this is a problem that we're looking at, especially for students and trying to figure out how do we solve this, which is to say, I have a browser, but that's all I have. And I don't really have the computing power nor the wherewithal to install a Python runtime or a Java runtime. And I just want to get started. And so I wondered, have you heard about the GitHub Codespaces project that we've been working on, where using VS Code, you attach to a Docker container running in the cloud, which has all of the compute. And then we're basically full circle now back to thin clients, mainframes, but it's as if you're coding locally, but the compute happening somewhere else in a large data center, somewhere in Utah. What are your thoughts on that as sort of like being the future of how we program?
If that worked as you describe, I think that would be fine. It sounds like a full circle. It's back to a modern incarnation of time sharing in some sense, where the information is somewhere else, and I'm interacting with my client is thin in some sense because it's basically, let's call it a keyboard, although it's probably richer because it's got a mouse and a better screen. But all of the information is stored elsewhere. All of the, actual computing engine is elsewhere. I think that that's absolutely fine. And if you were to provide me, as you're doing that, with something that looked like a conventional Unix, Linux file system, so that we're back to the file system, then I would be really quite happy with that. And in many ways, that would simplify life. There are clearly issues. Now you've got my data on your computer, and maybe I don't want to give you my data on your computer, but it's probably okay for most purposes. I'm dependent on proper connectivity, that is a reliable internet connection and things like that. But in principle, that should be just fine. And I guess since Microsoft now owns GitHub, this will actually work very well.
So, we hope so. We'll have to get you an invite. You can tell us what you think.
Yeah, no, it sounds like fun. Actually, this is totally by the way, but my colleague, Alan Donovan, you mentioned the Go book. My colleague, Alan, now is about to work for GitHub.
So, okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Great.
So,
we'll have to be asking him for the next interview internally then.
Oh, absolutely. You should definitely do it. He's just a fabulous guy.
Great. Wow, that's a lot to take in. I think that is great insight. You're absolutely right. There's going to be pros and cons to every single thing that is used. When you're teaching computer science courses, I'm not sure if you teach entry level or freshman level ones, what type of IDEs or tools are you typically encouraging students to use, and why?
So my teaching is a little weird. I'm teaching last fall, for example, a course that was about computing and communications, but for very non-technical people. So the average person in it was a history major or a philosophy major or something like that. And so it wasn't a programming class, but it was more like how do computers appear in society, and what can we do about it in various ways. But there was some programming, and this is in fact where I was using the Colab stuff because I wanted them to explore things like natural language processing. And so there were a lab or something where I say, okay, go pick a book that you like, that you can find online, and then go and do a bunch of the kind of analyses that are fairly straightforward with that, like counting words and looking for phrases that occur together and so on. So for that, the IDE was browser-based Colab or some equivalent, very straightforward. Our introductory course here, not the one that I'm teaching, but that uses Java, which I'm not sure that's the right choice, but okay. And I think that they used to use Dr. Java, and I don't even know what that is anymore. It's nothing very fancy. It's not up to the standard of the Visual Studio stuff. But when I look at kids around, they're often using computer science majors are often using Visual Studio or Sublime or something like that. And so I think it's all over the map, and we tend not to teach or require specific things, but let people pick up whatever they like. And I'm guessing that on average, people are probably just using Emacs or something not quite as powerful like Sublime, but something with maybe a slightly nicer user interface. And no, I'm not using either. So.
I was just going to say, well, back in the days when we could travel, I would fly around the country and mentor at various hackathons. And it was always interesting walking around, seeing what tools students were using. And now that we're in this very virtual society for the time being, and I mentioned my sister earlier, for example. She's finishing out her senior year at NYU, but she's living out here in Washington because New York and living in a little apartment probably wasn't the best choice for her right now. Yep. And I know that this is super common, amongst college students and many others. And we've seen things. So we have VS Code, which is probably one of the Visual Studios that you're referring to. Mm-hmm. And because of a lot of the remote work and really how important collaboration is when it comes to programming, we have the tools like LiveShare, where people can actually share their environments together. They can talk while they're doing it. You can come in and see what I'm coding and help me, find and fix whatever bug I'm running into, which I think for students is really phenomenal. So my question for you is, what do you think the importance and significance is of that with students working together and collaborating? Because projects don't get built by one person, projects get built by a team. And so how do you see that affecting kind of this generation that is really having to go through this virtual collaboration and collaborating not with one another in person?
I think that that experience sounds incredibly challenging. I mean, I find it hard to keep up with colleagues and the students that I'm working with and all of this, just because, I'm stuck at home, they're stuck at home, or someplace equally constrained. And that sort of talking to people in person is much higher bandwidth. You can get a lot more information back and forth. You can do things spontaneously, like write on the blackboard, or all of these kinds of things that are just not possible when you're using Zoom or Teams or pick your favorite. And so I think that it's probably interfering with the kind of collaborative experience, which is important for students who are going to go out and then perhaps work as software engineers somewhere. I taught for a long time a course that was a project-based course. The kids would get together in groups of 3 or 4 or 5, and they would design something from scratch and build it and present it in public and all of this kind of stuff. So it was a simulation of a little part of the reality of being in some company. And I don't know, I haven't taught it since the pandemic started. And so I honestly don't know how that works, but I suspect it does not work well. Because that kind of bonding experience that you would get by being in someplace, somebody's dorm room or in a dining hall or library or whatever, far into the night, arguing out how to make some piece of code work, or casting blame, whose bug is it, or all of these kinds of things that are part of working together. They don't work when you're not together that way. And so I don't know. I think, well, let's hope it's a short-term effect. But so far, we're week 50, at least locally, of lockdown and no kids, and so I'm not super optimistic. I think there's going to be a number of little hiccups of things, and that will be one of them. Probably not a giant one, but that's going to be one of them.
Well, if you want to run a pilot course on remote development and teams, I think it could be fascinating to do, especially with today's generation, when students are so agile and jumping to different technologies and scenarios and everything. If you want to run a pilot, I'm sure Burke and I can pull some strings and get that going. Don't you think, Burke?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we are in a pandemic, just to stay on that subject for a second. And because I don't want to gloss over the fact that many of us, professionals and students alike, have been at home for almost a year now. And there have been many companies that have adopted fully remote policies. I know that Facebook is one of them that has allowed people to stay remote. And many students have not been back in a classroom. Mm-hmm. I think that that's been incredibly difficult. It's been extremely difficult for me as a professional. In one of your interviews, you talked about at Bell Labs how people worked together and they would talk in the halls and they would collaborate. And then you said, and sometimes we would use email. But it's almost as if that was an afterthought. And it seems to me, my position is that we need to, the in-person dynamic is not something that is replaceable with all of the technology that we have today. And that I feel like we're worrying people that this is the future, right? What we're doing right now is the future. Me and Morgan and yourself will never, ever be in a room together having a conversation because those days are over. I just don't think that that's true. And I wanted to get your take on that.
I think you're fundamentally right. I think that people are, we're social animals in some sense. And so in various ways, we've evolved to interact with each other up close and personal in a lot of ways. And so I think that we will return to that kind of environment, but probably with modifications. One thing probably that we've learned from, let's call it Zoom or related technologies, is that it is actually possible to carry on useful work with people. You don't necessarily have to fly across the country or across the world to have a decent conversation with somebody. Sometimes it's important, you have to do it, but you don't have to perhaps do it as much as you did in the past. But at the same time, you lose that personal thing. And I think especially, in our business, the interaction, the technical interaction, where just talking to another person and being able to react in real time to what they're saying, or a group of people just sitting around a table arguing out how to do something, I think that's necessary. And I think even the companies that say, oh yeah, all remote all the time, are going to discover that people actually do want to be together. Maybe not as much. Maybe it would mean that you're only in a real office, 3 days a week or something like that. If somebody's got a long commute, like I was commuting to Google in New York for a while, and it was 2 hours each way, and that was a killer.
Right.
And so I think I was less productive. But if I could do that 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week, then it would be less of a problem. And the other 2 days, all big corporations have really good internal video systems. And so they're already familiar with that kind of thing. It's just now that the good video has been moved out to your houses rather than your offices. The other thing that I wonder what will happen is the pressure to pack more people into expensive downtown real estate. Sort of New York is the place I'm more familiar with. But presumably in places like Seattle area and the San Francisco area. Will that pressure somewhat decrease because you just won't need to put all of the people in the place all the time? I don't know. One of the things that Bell Labs did right, because space was not a pressure to anything like that degree, was that people had their own offices. And so you could sit in your own office and think, or write code, or talk on the phone, or all the other things that you might do without disturbing your neighbors. And you had a place that was yours. And it needn't be very big, although mine was sort of 10 by 12. And you don't see that as much in modern offices, at least if I extrapolate from the New York area. And I think we lost something when we put too many people in too close proximity. Again, the ones I'm familiar with were, desks that were 5 by 2.5 adjacent to each other, just rows of people. And it was hard, even with the best of intentions on everybody's part, to concentrate.
Right. And I think that the future, and I just want to send this out to people who feel like, oh no, we're going to be like this forever. We're not. And actually, I think the future is that you'll go to work when you want to, but the difference is that you won't have to go to work when you don't want to. So that it used to be that you had to be in the office 5 days a week, but I think we've now learned that you don't. And there's not every day that you're going to want to go in. And on those days, you're not going to have to. So it's actually going to be a better mix in the future than it was in the past, which I think is what you were getting at. 3 days a week, 2 days a week, whatever works for your team.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely going to be the case, and, and my hope is primarily that happens soon rather than another year of this.
You and me
Yeah.
both.
Hey, count me in on that too. No, and I think that brings up a great point too of we're realizing the things that we just kind of put up with, for lack of a better term, before, because it just was how it was. You know, you mentioned your 2-hour commute. When I was going to school in Massachusetts and I had a summer internship, I was commuting an hour and a half to 2.5 hours on the Mass Pike each way every day, early in the morning. I'm not going to mention on here what Massachusetts drivers are referred to as, but you get the picture. It was not fun. I was exhausted. I was putting my all into my internship. And I swore to myself I would never, ever put myself through that again, because it was destructive, like you mentioned, to my productivity. But also to my mental health. I wasn't enjoying it as much. I wasn't getting as much out of it. And so I think, although that's just one example, and the other being, you know, we're all stuck inside, going stir crazy. Hopefully you like who you live with, you know, sort of a thing. I think we're having more of these conversations about burnout and about mental health and about how important it is to realize what you're doing for yourself and to help yourself and to check in on those around you. And so to an extent, I do think that if there's a silver lining to the pandemic, it's that people are becoming more empathetic and wanting to talk about these sort of things and are there to help each other. Because, to be frank, you know, it was only part of the population before that was having to deal with these things, and talking about mental health has been very taboo for a very long time. Now that we're all going through it together, I think the conversations are emerging. So I would just love to get your take on if you've had much experience with that, you know, B, if that's something you're seeing with students, and C, if you kind of see this tabooness starting to lift as people are pushing back on, no, I don't have to commute 2 hours each way. It's not good for me. I only want to commute 2 hours each way, you know, 2 days a week.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the students, I think on campuses generally right now, mental health in various forms, but for example, depression in particular, that kind of thing seems to be on the rise. Just if you look at the amount of resources and attention that go into looking after the health, particularly the students, but also the staff, not even the faculty, are probably the best off of the bunch. But, you know, folks who are under lots of different kinds of pressures, and of course the being locked down, or alternately having to work and be out in public at a time when you'd rather not, put lots and lots of stress on lots of people. So I think that there's a lot more awareness of that at this point. I don't know whether we're better at coping with it in some sense. And arguably, we are in a very privileged position compared to a lot of people. You know, I can get curbside pickup for groceries. Somebody has to go to that store and walk through the aisles and get the stuff for me so that I don't have to leave my car to pick it up. And so that whoever's doing that kind of work is under a great deal more stress, both mental and physical, than I am in particular. So I think people are more aware of that at this point. I'm not sure society's figured out how to deal with that yet effectively. And so, you know, one hopes that we will actually get better next year or two. We will not go into politics, but, you know, I'm hopeful that various aspects of that will get better.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's sort of continue on that thread and take it a step further. Let's make it worse. Humans have begun to sort of face the reality that technology and the internet is powerful, and as overused Spider-Man quotes go, with great power comes great responsibility. So there appears to be an enormous downside to the amount of connectivity that we have and the inventions that we've made in good faith that seem to be able to cause real harm to societies and individuals. What do you think that we can do to ensure that technology is used as a force for good?
Yeah, right. Well, if I were running the world, I'm not sure what I would do with that one. But I think, I mean, that's extremely important. Technology is a two-edged sword, obviously. I think on balance, it's mostly good for us, but there are plenty of instances where, at least in the short run and perhaps longer, it is not good for us. And the ability of, let's call it social media, to amplify people who you would rather not have amplified, or to exacerbate divisions, or to pick open scabs, or promote just bizarre nonsensical conspiracy theories. That's something that I don't. Facebook started in 2004 or something like that, and I don't think anyone at that time predicted anything like the result that comes from that. Twitter is even newer, and again, predicting the effect of having a way to amplify a few people and broadcast to a very large number of people, and then divide things up into little separate populations. So I have my theory of how the world works, and you have a different theory. I hate you. Okay. That kind of thing is not something that's predicted. So how do we get out of that? And that I do not know. I suspect that it has got to be some combination of actual legal stuff, regulation, let's say legislation that puts some kind of better responsibility on corporations in particular, but perhaps individuals as well. It probably in the long run is going to have to be based on social norms, where people simply say, hey, that kind of stuff is not acceptable. We don't do that. And unfortunately, changing people's social behaviors is often quite a slow process. If you look at the various things that in this country and other parts of the world as well, just seems sort of obvious. We should behave in a particular way, but we don't. It takes a very, very long time to deal with that better. For example, the history of racial inequality in the United States, we're still fighting that. Women's rights, still fighting that. Not to quite the same degree, but definitely still there. And I worry about the rise of, let's call it far right, populist kinds of, almost fascist operations. That's another potential problem. And I don't know how we deal with that except to get more people thinking, hey, that stuff's nuts. We're not going to do it that way. We're going to try and do it right. Hard to do that.
I agree. And I don't have the answer either. I think for myself, my current position here has been to is to try to be as positive as possible in every interaction with every person, regardless of where they fall and what their worldview is, and to try to listen to each other. I think that one of the things that technology does is that it changes the dynamic. Even the dynamic that you and I have on this call is not the same as if I was sitting across from you. And if I couldn't see you, it would be even worse. And if I didn't know you at all, it's even worse. And so it's this episode of Gilligan's Island where Gilligan finds these seeds, and they eat them, and they realize they can read each other's minds. And by the end of the show, they take all the seeds and they chuck them into the lagoon to destroy them, because the whole Gilligan's Island society has crumbled and fallen apart. And it does seem to me that technology is a bit like those seeds, and that we can all now hear what everyone else is thinking all the time. And not only that, but we voluntarily tune into the stream of it on a daily basis. Yeah. And so I think that the solution to this is to think better thoughts.
Yeah, well, that for sure. It's funny that theme of, being able to read other people's minds is something that was science fiction that I was reading when I was a teenager. I don't think I ever watched Gilligan's Island. It shows that I missed a generation or something like that. But the parallel of that, let it all hang out and everybody knows what you're thinking is maybe not exactly right. You don't want that. And it looks like the social media has in some sense made it possible again to just exacerbate the bad behavior that we could limit.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that analogy I just used came from Christopher, our producer. I can't remember if that was the conversation. Somebody gave me that analogy with the Gilligan's Island. I was like, that's exactly what's happening.
So on a kind of a different note that I'd love to swap to, I think a lot of students, when we're chatting with them, they say, oh, you're a Microsoft employee, you're at the point that I want to be at. What advice do you have for me? And so I have a two-part question for you. Is what advice would you have if you had one single piece of advice to give to computer science, student technologists, or aspiring folks in STEM today, let's say around the 20-year-old age mark for sake of argument? And then also, if you could go back in time and you could talk to your 20-year-old self, what piece of advice would you give to yourself?
I think the general advice is maybe something that I said a little earlier, this idea of being able to communicate well with other people. I think that really is important. If you can write well, that's sort of action at a distance. It amplifies whatever you have to say for people that you might never meet or have any direct interaction with. And certainly for me, it's worked out well with writing books because that's a way for me to say something that I hope will be useful and somebody else can get some benefit from it, and I will never meet them. And so being able to do that well, and it doesn't mean you have to go and write books or anything, but just be able to express yourself. And then the same thing with, written or spoken conversation, being able to give good talks or presentations or something like that. And again, not necessarily the people who are in your particular field, but outsiders as well. I think all of that is probably useful, and I think that's independent of whatever field you're in. I think that applies whether you're a technologist or not, but it maybe is more important for technology people because in some sense we're insiders. We have our own language and jargon and so on, and at the same time what we do is actually affects a very wide swath of the population. And so it's probably more important for us to be able to communicate better about what's going on, what the important things are. So that I think would be the most important thing. What would I say to my 20-year-old self? Jeez, and if I look back, kids ask me from time to time about, basically career planning kinds of things. What should I do? And the answer is, I don't know. And if I look at my own, career or whatever you want to call it, an awful lot of it is kind of like rolling down a hill and you run into a boulder and you go this way instead of that way. And it mostly works out. And occasionally it does. But there's very little planning in my part that's been involved. I think, however, Pasteur it was who said, chance favors the prepared mind. And so the idea is the more things that you have thought about, the more people you know, the more things you've learned, all this kind of stuff, the more likely it is that when something comes along and you run into that boulder, you'll bounce in the right direction. So, and that's a badly screwed up metaphor, but.
No, I totally agree with everything you just said there. I think that people say, how do you get these opportunities? And I always say, sure, some opportunities will come to you, but really you have to sometimes make opportunities yourself. If there's any potential, sure, you may get told no a million times, but all it takes is that one yes. That's how I actually joined Microsoft. I was finishing up my last year of university, but I didn't have a computer science degree. I was simultaneously doing my undergrad and grad degrees. So I was like a walking zombie at that point. And I saw the Microsoft booth at the career fair and I was like, oh, I love Microsoft. I like what they stand for. I think they are really trying to, do good in the world. But once again, don't have a computer science degree. I had an offer from the company I interned at, which I think was a little bit tainted, or me wanting to take it because of that awful commute I had to do. To be frank with you, it sticks with you. And so I ended up chatting at the Microsoft booth. There were two software engineers and then the recruiter. And I look back and I say, if I had talked to either of those software engineers, they would have immediately said, you don't even have a CS degree. Why are you here? But the recruiter said, no, let me step back and take a look at the bigger picture. Okay, you've worked on these interdisciplinary projects. You've been on student government. You'll pick up on more of the technical stuff if that's what you're worried about, but it's really that base skill set. And so I think my lucky stars every day that, hey, they didn't come to me, but I took that chance of, let's go have a conversation, and that led. And so that's something I frequently tell students too is, there's no one traditional path to getting somewhere. Like you said, you hit a boulder and you may go a different direction, even if it's not the one you wanted to go. But I think there's value in every single opportunity we have, every single boulder that we hit along the way. But yes, being prepared and being cognizant and being ready to take or make opportunities that are getting you closer on that right path, I think are incredibly valuable. And I think a lot of people don't realize till maybe it's too late, or aren't networking until they're well into their careers in industry and those sort of things. So I think that's absolutely excellent advice.
Yeah. Yeah. And networking has sometimes a negative connotation. It's like you're sucking up to people to try and make connections in some way. But there's a much stronger positive connotation, which is you getting to know people. And ultimately that's what matters. And the way you can do that most effectively is to be interested in lots of things, and in particular, discover what other people are interested in, because no matter what kind of weird things people do, it's intrinsically interesting. It must be because they're doing it. And therefore, try and absorb some of what it is that they're doing. I'm going to have to leave you guys relatively soon because I'm about to run a seminar in digital humanities. And all of the students in my little seminar are computer science majors, but they're looking at problems in the humanities, history and art and music and all these kinds of things, because there's a nice blend of stuff there. And so they're doing this kind of go across different boundaries to explore how something they know about in technology might be interesting or relevant to people whose interests are completely different, and vice versa. So that's my example of it.
We'll let you get to it then. We thank you so much for your time, Dr. Brian Kernighan, everybody, creator of Hello World. Thank you so much for the legacy that you've left us. I'm still writing Hello World. I'm 42 years old. I wrote it yesterday.
Okay. Morgan, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you folks. I hope this comes out well for you. It's been just a blast for me.
Thank you so much for your
Sounds
time.
good. And let us know if there's anything that we can help you with in return, please.
Got it.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Okay.